Okay, so what do you think the chances are of a double dip recession?
Personally, I think the chances are pretty high, but then I've been quite bearish on the economy for the last 5 or 6 years. I think that the government spending cuts have only just started to kick in last month, although they've been spoken about for a long time. The actual full effects haven't started yet. Councils have only just started laying people off from March, April time, so that's going to flow through to the economy. They'll maybe have a few months of severance pays, redundancy packages, things like that. But then when all that money starts to run out, people will again look and think, can I afford this? Should I be spending on that? So I think the retail sector in particular is going to suffer. And I also think that people will start to struggle to afford their mortgages. Even though interest rates are still at historic lows, I really do think that interest rates will have to go up in the next 6 or 8 months at the latest, because the Bank of England can't keep blaming everybody else for high inflation. And although it might come back, they're even saying themselves it's going to be a couple of years before it falls back to their 2% target. So when you combine rising interest rates and people losing their jobs with a private sector that hasn't really recovered fully as yet at all, manufacturing's doing quite well, but that's just because of the pound being so weak. That's not going to last forever. So I think you combine the effects of all those things, and then people will really start to think about what they need to spend their money on, and it will just be essentials. They might struggle to pay their mortgages. They'll think about changing their car. They'll start shopping and buying cheaper food and things like that. So they might flock to brands, but I really do think that they're going to be tightening their belt quite a lot over the next year, 18 months.
It's depressing.
It's quite miserable. But yeah, I think to counteract that though, in terms of the positive stuff, if inflation does drop back in the next year or so, and say the price of oil drops back as well, so people's costs, their heating bills and electricity bills and things like that, filling their car up, if those costs come down, it's quite a big psychological impact, is those few things. So just the price of a few things dropping could make people disproportionately happier and more willing to spend. So there is a bit of a kind of caveat, but yeah, my overriding feeling is one of being quite negative.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I've been for a long time though, and I got it wrong for the first few years.
Oh, well, I hope on this occasion you're wrong.
Fingers crossed.
Get back again. Okay, so do you think inflation will fall back in the next couple of years?
Personally, no, I don't, because it's been driven by commodities boom, and it's been driven by economies like China, India and Brazil, which are still growing at a much faster rate than developed European economies and the US. And these economies aren't going to slow down because, quite simply, they can't. I was reading some quite interesting stuff on China recently saying that by 2025 they're going to have 250 cities with more than 1 million people in them, which is just huge. At the moment, in the whole of Europe, there's only 32 cities with more than 1 million people in them. They're going to have to spend, I think it's $300 billion just on their energy infrastructure in the next 10 years, just to cope with the level of electricity demand, things like that, whether it's water as well. They need to invest in cleaning up their whole water tables, because at the minute it's polluted with chemicals from industry all over the place. So they've got loads and loads of money to spend. So if you combine that with a massive urbanisation of the Chinese population, I think it's going to rise from 535 million people in 2008 to 970 million people will be living in Chinese cities by the year 2025. And they're all going to want somewhere to live. They'll want a house with, say, a fridge and a TV. So with forces like that, you just can't really counteract it. So I think inflation will be driven higher for potentially the next 5 or 10 years at least, just by those factors.
Okay, and what do you think the housing market will do in the next few years?
I think house prices are going to fall, primarily because people are asking too much for the houses that they're putting on the market. Excuse me. The Rightmove index shows that the average asking price on their website is £240,000, whereas the average for actual houses sold is close to 170,000. So there's a really big disconnect there. Unless everybody on Rightmove is living in nice detached houses in the suburbs or in London, then you could understand that, but that's not going to be the case. So at some point there has to be a moving together of those things. So have the house prices that people are willing to pay or able to pay have got to increase, and the people who are selling their houses have got to accept a more realistic price. But allied to that, the fact that mortgage availability is still incredibly low. It's incredibly tough to get a mortgage unless you've got a 25-30% deposit still, and even if you do get one, the actual rates that they're charging are still really high compared to base rates at 0.5%. So I think all those factors are going to mean the housing market probably stays relatively flat to down over the next few years.